Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Jonathan Armstrong for another episode of the award-winning Life with GDPR. Welcome back, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks for having me.
You are thinking about cookies, and I'm going to have to assume that it's not because of Lent and you have given up cookies for this traditional holiday season of fasting. It's some other form of cookie.
Yeah, it is, Tom. Yeah. We've had episodes of cookie enforcement, so the technology-related cookies that appear on websites before, but that seems to be ramping again. And this isn't just, I think, a data protection issue. I think it's a wider compliance issue as well, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. But many people get really annoyed by cookie banners. I'm one of them on the bottom of websites, but they are required, and there are also fairly granular rules about how those banners should look. You can't make people do lots of things to configure. There should be a reject or accept button. They have to be of equal prominence. You can't use colors. You can't use nudge theory, etc., etc. And we do quite a lot of cookies clinics for clients these days. It's usually easier to show them what things should look like visually, and the rules can be quite complex. But enforcement is stepping up as well. For example, a couple of weeks ago, the Autorité Behind Heavens, the Dutch regulator, fined an outfit called Cool €40,000 for not doing its cookies compliance correctly, and it gave it 7 weeks to make changes. And effectively, they'd provided links to the cookie policy. They'd done some good things. They had altered the look and feel of their website after the AP intervened. But as I say, still a significant fine and an order that they improve. Now, there's quite a lot of litigation about cookies as well. There are some individuals in the UK who are writing to a lot of US corporations seeking damages. There's regulatory action. There are issues with third parties using data. So, for example, if an ad agency or a big tech company uses cookies on your website, they're probably harvesting the data to sell at auction. Do you know who's buying that? We looked at a case, for example, with a defense contractor where details of visitors to their secure site seem to be available at auction. You don't know who's going to buy this stuff. And obviously, if you use cookies, then you're funding the ad ecosystem. And some people aren't that comfortable with that. Now, in addition, the regulatory regime is supported in some respects via one number of complaints from Matt Schrems and his group NOYB, and he's featured on these podcasts before. As people know, NOYB have made more than 1,000 complaints about cookies on websites. They have some specific tech that helps them to do that, so much so that the EDPB, the Data Protection Coordination Force across the EU, has a special task force just looking at NOYB Schrems-related complaints. And that's led to guidelines in at least 16 different countries on what cookies should look like. We've also had a lot of fines. A straw poll I did a week or so ago, not scientific, but suggests that there have been about 76 GDPR fines that deal with cookies, and that's raised about €260 million for EU regulatory authorities. And that action has been more or less across the EU. In France, for example, the retailer Carrefour was fined £2.25 million. And in Norway, Grindr, the LGBT lifestyle site, if we call it that, was fined €5.7 million. And the Grindr fine is particularly interesting to see almost the unintended consequences of cookies. It is alleged that Grindr had cookies on their site, which again led to an auctioning of personal data. It is alleged that as a result, LGBT people received higher prices for things like life insurance, as they were supposedly more prone to receive sexual diseases, etc., by nature of their lifestyle. So, whilst many corporations think they can tolerate cookies, there can be a fairly dark ecosystem behind that. And the UK hasn't missed the party either. A week or so ago, the UK data protection regulator said that cookies were going to be a renewed focus there. They relaunched their cookies enforcement activity on January 20th. They've investigated 1,000 websites so far. The results are out for the initial 200, and the ICO said that they've communicated compliance concerns to 134 of that 200, and that might lead to further compliance activity. So it's definitely a hot area of compliance. As I say, litigation risk underlines that. And I have a point plan that people could follow if they want to try and improve. First of all, you have to check the cookies on your site. Secondly, make sure that your cookie banner is compliant and it reflects those cookies. Thirdly, look at the cookie banner itself. It can't have pre-checked boxes. It can't use nudge theory. Fourthly, watch the cookie that is supporting the cookie banner. Now, I know that sounds a bit Alice in Wonderland, that we're going round in circles, but some of the tools that cookie banners on websites don't comply with the cookie law themselves. So you don't want to have a poison that's worse than the disease. Fifthly, look at the third parties that you use. If, for example, you have an edit function on the bottom of your website, then that might well be throwing cookies from big tech providers that, again, don't comply. Number 6, look at retention periods. Some cookies never expire. How do you justify that? If the role of the cookie is to make sure that, for example, somebody who has sight issues can have text read to them, why do you need to keep that for longer than their life? Many cookies are set for more than a year for analytics purposes. Again, you don't need cookies that last that long. You're going to have to justify anything that lasts longer than a session. Number 7, I think you need to react quickly to litigation, threats of litigation, data subject requests asking for cookie data, data protection authorities knocking on your door. And 8th, they're simple, be honest. A lot of people are misleading about their cookies. Their privacy policies don't refer to the cookies that they're using. And they'll say things like, we don't share or sell data, when they clearly do through their use of cookies. And again, that's likely to lead to regulatory enforcement. So I don't think it's just a tech issue anymore. I think it's a broader compliance issue, particularly where it interacts with things like unfairness. And it is a renewed area of enforcement.
Jonathan, let me start with a personal picayune of companies that have a button accept all or manage, which means you have to go into the deep bowels and figure out what is what. In listening to your remarks, I hope those are only American companies. Otherwise, I hope the ICO spanks them with a double-sided paddle, because they irritate me to no end. Are you still seeing those sorts of buttons where the consumer has to make the selection and they make it as difficult as possible?
I am. Yes, that's definitely still happening. And a colleague of mine has advised a business not to do it, and they're still doing it. And I guess they just found a different counsel or ignored that advice. But that is a real area of risk, I think. As I've said, it must be as easy to opt out as it is to opt in. You can't use things like nudge theory. You can't use colors. You can't use, technically that's called second tier preference setting. All of those practices are likely to be unlawful in many EU jurisdictions.
And what do you anticipate, or you have a sense of what the overall fine and penalty would be? Are the regulators going to disincentivize this conduct through regulatory enforcement? Or is this just the cost of doing business so you can scrape the data and then resell it or use it for own nefarious purposes?
I think there is definitely an intention to get to the bottom of the ad ecosystem. There are parallel issues around things like newspapers, where the online version conditions your free use of the newspaper on a banner that says that they're going to take your data and sell it. There is lots of regulatory activity, as I've said, north of 1,000 complaints, and you can. Trem's, to his credit, is quite transparent about this. You can go onto the website and you can look at the enforcement activity and who they've got in their sites. And is a large number of people that are in their sites, many well-known US corporations in all sorts of different areas are likely to face enforcement action. And pressure groups like the NOYB aren't going to go away anytime soon.
Is there a difference, in your opinion, at least at this point, on enforcement in the United Kingdom under the ICO as opposed to the EU, or do you see more consistency?
I think there's more consistency in this area. That it's not just a GDPR issue. There's also another piece of legislation that's sometimes called the Cookies Directive. There was an attempt to upgrade that legislation. It seems that attempt has stalled at the moment, but there still is use of the existing law to do that, particularly in France, where investigations tend to look both at the cookies specific law and at GDPR in parallel.
If this was a podcast on perhaps any other risk, we would say the first thing you do is assess your own risk. Does that hold true in the area of cookies, whether it's Lent or not?
Yeah, I think it does. The slight difference here, though, is that I think many organizations don't really know the cookies that are on their website because they're relying on things like Google to serve YouTube content or LinkedIn to support some of the recruitment content or Facebook to allow customers to engage. They're not really sure of the cookies that those widgets are. And of course, they're responsible for those cookies as well if it's on their domain. I've had clients, for example, where you ask them how many cookies they're using and they say it's 7 or 8. In one case, the answer was, I think, 220. So people underestimate the use of their own use of cookies. Google Analytics, for example, if you're using that for analytics on your website, that might be throwing 12, 15 different cookies for that widget alone. So you need to look at what third parties are doing in your name, as well as what your own employees are doing.
Jonathan, this would seem to me to be one of the most straightforward, but perhaps it's not as straightforward as I had thought, because as you just indicated, many companies themselves are unaware of the cookies on their own site. So I guess that the story will be continued.
I'm afraid. And I think compliance is relatively simple. We've done straightforward clinics for people and they've managed to fix most of the stuff. Sometimes that's a decision. Sometimes you've got to switch off some functionality if you can't make it compliance. But again, they're decisions where there's plenty of knowledge around to help you guide you through it.
You mentioned in a little bit earlier about the length of time you might keep that information. Are there any general guidelines you can give a company, or is it literally a company by company or case by case basis?
I think it depends what the cookie's doing. As a general rule, cookies are only justifiable for a session, so that website session, unless there's another pressing reason, might be, for example, to enable a shopping cart so that people can come back and make a purchase if you've made that clear to them. Maybe you can justify keeping it for 24 hours. There are other reasons that could be considered to be justifiable. But it's one of those things where you're going to have to list what the cookie's name is, what it does, how long you keep it for, and if it's more than a session, what's the justification. So a simple 4-column table might do the job. You might update that. You might keep it on your website and just be very transparent with people about it.
Jonathan, I think we're unfortunately near the end of our time for this episode, but as I said a little bit earlier, I think we'll have the opportunity to revisit this topic.
My pleasure, Tom. Thank you.